Cold neon lights beamed down as Scopes growled like a beast, slamming his foot into Maya's chest. "You're nothing but trash. Lick my boots if you want to belong here." Dazed her, lip split and bleeding, she still raised her head. "This kick will make you hang yours low while I'll stand tall." His scornful laugh echoed like a blade drowning out the crowd's fear. A trembling student lifted their phone, the lens capturing every bit of cruelty. And just 3 minutes later, the man who thought he held the law would be crushed by the world in disgrace. Night stretched endlessly over the highway where the empty road swallowed every sound, leaving only the wind sweeping past the lamppost, casting flickering shadows onto the cold cement. The neon glow from the gas station spilled out in unsteady halos, pale blue and white, layers stacking like mist, yet unable to push back the darkness surrounding everything. The steady ticking from the old sign sounded like rusted metal, groaning through the night, blending into a silence that felt both mournful and menacing. Occasionally, the engine of a distant truck would echo faintly, heavy and sluggish, then vanish, as if the entire road was just a void. No one stopped at a place this deserted at this hour, except those who had no other choice. Maya Brown opened the car door and stepped out, moving with the weariness of someone who had driven hundreds of miles without finding a real place to rest. Her eyes were dull, but inside them remained a flicker of alertness and resolve. She gripped the gas nozzle, the sharp fumes hitting her nose and burning her eyes, forcing her to take a deep breath to stay composed. The neon light washed over her skin with a sickly pallor, making her exhaustion even more visible. But beneath it all was a quiet strength that refused to be hidden. All she wanted was to fill the tank pay and leave no conversations, no encounters, not in this fragile moment. The emptiness of the station, the shadows bleeding in from all sides, made her feel like she had stepped into a massive box where anything could explode in an instant and no one would know or intervene. The car door slammed shut with a sharp crack tearing through the stillness. A police cruiser was parked at an angle across the lot, and from it emerged a tall figure, the neon light bending and stretching his shadow into a long twisted smear across the cement. Deputy Scopes, his face flushed maybe from liquor, not yet faded, maybe from the arrogance baked into his blood. He stood tall, chin lifted, his eyes sweeping the scene like a man who owned the land beneath his feet. Each of his steps thudded against the concrete like slow, deliberate strikes of authority, heavy enough for everyone to feel the intent behind them. As the light hit his face, a crooked, cold smile formed a smile with no trace of goodwill. He looked at Maya as if he were seeing a trespasser in his territory, an unwanted presence that had no right to exist there. "This station looks like it's open for black folks tonight," he said, each word dropping onto the dry ground like gravel. He didn't have to raise his voice. It was sharp enough to cut through the air already thick with loneliness. The line came out like a sentence, as if skin color determined who had the right to exist here. He stood there, proud and still waiting for a reaction, fear in her eyes, a lowered head, or at least the quiet submission he thought he was owed. Maya froze her hand, still gripping the pump handle, eyes fixed on the steady stream of fuel flowing into the tank, the sharp stench of gasoline thick in the air making her head spin. Her heart beat one notch faster, but her face remained calm. She had heard words like that her whole life, from crowded streets to the narrow alleys where she grew up, and they had never broken her. This time, in the flickering light with the towering shadow in front of her, the contempt cut deep like a blade. But instead of retreating, it made her resolve flare even stronger. She raised her head, eyes hard and cold, steady and unflinching. "I'm just getting gas. What are you planning to do?" Her voice rang out, not loud but solid, each word like an arrow slicing through the heavy air. Those few syllables made the sky seem to bend down and listen. There was no trembling, no fear, only the weight of self-possession in a moment where most would have turned away. The air thickened so tightly it seemed the breeze itself tore as it passed. The smile on Scopes's face twisted further, turning into open disdain. His eyes flared not out of surprise at her answer, but from fury at being defied. In his mind, a black woman standing upright meeting his gaze and responding was an insult beyond forgiveness. He drew in a breath through clenched teeth, the faint hiss like a signal that violence was on the brink. In that brief instant, Maya stood out beneath the dull neon light, upright like a sturdy tree in a storm. Her shadow stretched across the cement facing Scopes's warped silhouette as if two beings from opposite worlds had met. On one side was the quiet pride of someone who had endured enough contempt to know she could never yield. On the other was arrogance used to power and the habit of crushing others. The light flickered, the gas fumes rose, the insects kept chirping into the night, but all of it was background to a moment so tense it seemed to press the air from the lungs. Scopes let out a dry laugh, sharp and joyless, echoing through the desolate gas station. It was the sound of a blade scraping rock, jarring and full of threat. He didn't respond right away, just stepped forward once more, his shadow stretching farther, swallowing the space where Maya stood. No more words were needed, his presence alone declared it in his eyes. This was the domain of the strong, and he was the law. The sky in the distance remained pitch black. The highway lay empty like a silent river, leaving the two of them locked in a standoff with no exit. The gas station became a small theater, the stage lit for just two players, a cop soaked in contempt and a weary woman who refused to bow. And in that moment the curtain rose on a dark play that anyone who witnessed would struggle to forget. Scopes didn't stop after his first provocation. His shadow loomed over Maya with each step. Closer, the stench of sweat and stale cigarettes clinging to his uniform seeping out with every breath. His hand rested firmly on the grip of his holstered gun fingers, tapping in short, deliberate beats like a warning that a single motion could turn the place into a bloodbath. A shout burst from his throat, echoing under the gas station's tin roof. "I'm the law here. You understand?" Each word hit the air like a blow, cutting through the silence and pushing the tension to its peak. Maya kept her head up, staring straight at him, her eyes still lit, even as her heart pounded a beat too fast in her chest. She took a deep breath, her voice steady and clear. "The law has no color." The words floated out gently like a breeze, but struck straight at his pride, and the smile on Scopes's face stiffened into a tight, frozen line. In that moment, everything around the gas station seemed to freeze. The station clerk, a middle-aged man who had been hiding behind the counter window, peeked out when he heard the shouting. His eyes widened, and at the sight before him he quickly yanked down the plastic curtain, trying to remove himself from the trouble. He knew, Scopes knew the man's temper and his casual disregard for rules, so even with sweat forming in his palms, he chose to stay hidden and pretend he hadn't seen anything. In that silence, Maya felt her isolation like a weight, as if the world had turned away, but she wouldn't let herself tremble. The exhaustion from her long journey was replaced now by a cold clarity. Scopes growled, taking another step forward, his boots thudding on the concrete like hammers. "You better learn to kneel before I make you crawl." His voice was thick, boiling with rage wrapped in blind confidence. His eyes sparked, full of hostility, with no attempt to hide the desire to crush. For him, it wasn't just a threat. It was pleasure, the reflex of someone drunk on dirty power, used to turning humiliation into entertainment. Maya inhaled deeply, the harsh gasoline fumes stabbing into her nose, forcing her to center herself with sheer will. In front of her stood the man the whole town feared, but that fear didn't blur the memories of injustice she had carried all her life. As a child, she saw her father pinned to the curb by a cop just for speeding his skin too dark to be ignored. Over the years, she'd been stopped for ID checks countless times, always for looking suspicious. All of it had built up layer by invisible layer into scar tissue, and now, in this moment, she knew she couldn't bow. Her eyes burned, not with anger, but with something deeper, the last unbroken piece of pride she still held. Scopes looked into her eyes and felt almost involuntarily a wave of defiance spreading through the air. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black woman standing alone in the dead of night. The more he thought about it, the more he felt the need to prove his words had weight, that the name Scopes sewn onto this uniform had the power to crush any resistance. He glanced quickly toward the booth, saw the curtain was down, and knew no one would dare step in. That feeling of being king over a small corner of the world thrilled him, but also pushed him to escalate further. Maya didn't blink, her lips pressing together to keep her trembling hands still. She knew that any trace of fear would only invite him to push harder. His voice hissed out again, louder now, sharper. "Don't think standing here makes you my equal. Black folks are born to bow." Each word drove like a knife into the past already full of wounds. But instead of breaking her, they cracked something open, and memory surged forward, fueling the fire in her eyes. She didn't need to yell. Her steel gaze spoke in her place. Scopes felt sweat slick across his palm and instinctively gripped the handle of his gun tighter to steady himself. His shadow stretched wide over Maya, but the calm in her stance made the darkness seem thinner. He bit his lip, teeth grinding, then let out a barking laugh, sharp and bitter, echoing wildly across the concrete lot. In his mind, forcing this woman to her knees would be the ultimate proof of control, a fresh trophy to brag about. But in Maya's eyes, he saw no fear, no pleading, only a wall, one that struck back harder the more he tried to shatter it. The wind picked up, spreading the smell of gasoline across the lot, thickening the air. Maya dropped the pump handle, stood upright, forcing her spine to hold, even as exhaustion weighed down every muscle. Scopes's words still rang in her ears like pounding blows, but her heart beat a different rhythm, one of pride that held her steady. Under flickering neon, the two shadows faced each other, one tall and arrogant, the other thin but unshakable. The distance between them was so slight that just one step could set everything off, and the heavy silence seemed to wait for that breaking point. The silence dragged on, stretching unbearably until Scopes finally leaned in, his voice rough as stone, grinding. "Get on your knees, or I'll make you crawl like a dog." His words hit the pavement like spikes, sharp and cruel. Maya lifted her head, eyes blazing, and said nothing, letting each breath speak her defiance. In the cold emptiness of the gas station, in that choking darkness, the clash between two stares became a duel between a man who wore the badge like a crown and a weary woman who refused to bend, now locked in a moment that could never be undone. The heavy air at the gas station seemed to shatter when Scopus suddenly lunged forward, his rough hand clamping onto Maya's wrist with a force that made her joints crack. The grip wasn't the action of someone trying to restrain it, was the blow of an enemy full of hate, laced with spite, and the reflex of unchecked authority. Maya stumbled, her body tipping off balance, feet sliding back across the cold cement, the gas nozzle clattering to the ground. In that moment, she felt the pressure from his grip spread through her like a vice, the blood in her veins seeming to freeze. Scopes hissed, his face flushed, red, hot breath hitting her skin, eyes lit with contempt. Maya clenched her teeth, trying to stay upright, but he didn't give her the chance to regain control. In a flash, before she could steady herself, his kick exploded, swift, direct, and vicious like a final strike. "Get up, you piece of trash!" he roared, the sound tearing through the night like a wild animal's howl. His boot drove straight into her stomach, a blow packed with hatred and pride cutting off the air in her lungs. Pain surged through her, slicing open the silence like a scream. Maya was thrown backward, her body slamming onto the concrete with a dull, cracking thud that made the world tilt. Her breath caught mouth open with no sound, just the rush of heat forced upward until she coughed uncontrollably. She clutched her stomach, feeling each painful pulse radiate through her core. Her vision blurred, the only thing left were distorted streaks of flickering neon overhead. In that instant, when all strength seemed drained, Maya still fought to hold on to consciousness. Scopes's breath came heavy above her like a victorious growl, his eyes' gleaming mouth curled into a cruel grin. To him, the kick was proof of absolute power, a statement that he could crush anyone without fear of consequence. But in Maya's eyes, something else flared, a spark from someone still enduring, not yet broken, a resistance that burned silently but fiercely. The gas station was dead quiet, only Maya's ragged breathing mixed with the wind scraping across the metal roof. A truck driver nearby gripped his steering wheel, wide-eyed, frozen in place, feet rooted to the ground, unable to move. Just a few yards away, two young men who had come to buy drinks now stood motionless, faces pale, eyes locked forward like under a spell. They had seen the kick, heard the insults, watched Maya's pain, yet in their gaze was only the recoil of fear, the dread that doing anything might make them the next target. Maya lay there, her back pressed against the freezing concrete, arms wrapped around her cramping stomach. Her breath came in short bursts, throat dry and raw, but her eyes never left Scopes's face. She stared at him as if trying to burn his image into memory so the pain would not remain just a personal wound, but become evidence of the brutality he had delivered. The ache made sweat stream down her face, each drop sliding over her cheek and falling to the cement, merging with the dim shifting light. Scopes raised his chin, took a deep breath, and looked down at the woman beneath him with satisfaction. In his mind, this was a perfect scene. He was the one in control, and she was the image of defeat. He barked out another line, his voice rough, laced with the sourness of alcohol, trying to stamp in the humiliation. "There you were born to be beneath my feet." The words dropped like slabs of stone, heavy and suffocating in an already crushed atmosphere. The witnesses, though silent, felt the cruelty laid bare with no effort to conceal it. The truck driver bit his lip until it bled, while the two young men trembled, their hands clenched around their phones, but too afraid to raise them. Fear turned them to statues, and their silence made Scopes's kick even more brutal, amplified by the helplessness that surrounded it. The entire gas station had become a dark stage with only one man speaking, and his victim forced to perform at the bottom. Maya kept breathing through the pain, each gasp tearing through her chest. Thoughts flashed through her mind of the streets where she grew up, days spent chasing after her father, and her mother's rough hands wiping sweat from her brow. Those memories surfaced in a single moment, reminding her that this kick would not define her worth. Though her body trembled, her eyes locked on the man above her, making sure he knew his violence had not erased her pride. Scopes paid no attention to that silent defiance. To him, the silence of the crowd, Maya's collapse, and the store clerk's retreat were a total victory. He breathed deep, stood tall, and glanced around like a man who had just restored order. He believed that in this empty place, no evidence could undo him. But just as he felt untouchable, those trembling eyes had already become witnesses, and in their silence, a small flame had been lit, waiting for its chance to ignite. The silence hanging over the gas station felt like a thick layer of ice, making every breath sound sharp and unnatural. Maya still lay on her side against the cold cement, arms wrapped around her stomach, struggling to push herself upright. Pain tore through her chest, but her eyes remained locked on Scopes. A young man near the other pump raised his trembling hand, phone pointed toward the scene. The glow from the screen flickered like a faint candle in the dark, but immediately Scopes's sharp glare cut toward him. His eyes narrowed, a cruel grin spread across his face, and his voice slashed through the night. "Try filming, I'll kick you too." The words dropped like a hammer, making the young man flinch, his hand jerking as he quickly lowered the phone. The screen went dark, and with it the flicker of courage vanished. Maya clenched her teeth, pushing herself up with one hand on the freezing cement joint, screaming in pain. She exhaled, her voice shaky, but still breaking through the heavy silence like an arrow. "You think that kick will shut me up?" The words were faint and volume but strong and intent, freezing the thick air for just a second. Scopes squinted, a mix of anger and amusement rising in his chest. He let out a loud, ragged laugh laced with alcohol and arrogance, echoing across the station like rusted metal scraping over stone. He stepped closer, boot slamming next to Maya's face, and growled with vicious finality, "Shut your mouth. You're not worthy to lift your head." His steps hit the cement with a heavy, menacing rhythm, like a warning bell ringing through the air. The two young men lowered their heads, avoiding Scopes' eyes, hearts pounding from fear. One of them swallowed hard, the tiny sound cutting sharply through the silence. The truck driver clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, eyes shut tight, fighting the urge to get out, but the weight of authority pressed so hard on his chest it locked him in place. The curtain inside the station booth stayed drawn, and though the man behind it was almost certainly peeking through the gap, his silence blended into the collective quiet of the crowd. Only Maya's broken, shallow breathing remained, paired with Scopes' sneering laughter. Every breath was a battle, each inhale dragging pain through her ribs, every exhale interrupted by the spasms in her stomach. But her eyes stayed open, fixed on the officer standing above her. They weren't the eyes of someone defeated, they were eyes that recorded, that carved each second into memory, like etching a wound into personal and collective history. That stare made Scopes' smile even more grotesque because he believed the deeper the humiliation, the stronger his hold on power. The stillness was so complete that even the flickering neon buzzed loudly, its cold blue light flashing on and off, reflecting in Scopes' bloodshot eyes, revealing veins pulsing with rage. The silence of the crowd wasn't agreement. It was paralysis, born of fear. That fear was exactly what Scopes fed on. It sustained his arrogance and served as proof of his power. Maya could feel it radiating around her, but she also saw it for what it was, a shield for cruelty. In silence, violence becomes permissible, and in averted eyes, the arrogant find strength. Scopes leaned closer, his face just inches from Maya's breath, reeking of cigarettes and alcohol, spilling straight into her skin. His lips curled as he whispered loud enough for the whole lot to hear, "I'll teach you how to survive in this town. Crawl or die." The words slipped through his teeth sharp as a blade, deepening the fear already thick in the air. One young man trembled, his eyes on the verge of tears, but still didn't dare lift his phone. The truck driver bit his lip, wondering how many times he'd seen scenes like this and never said a word. Now, silence weighed like stone, pressing down on every shoulder, turning them all into helpless statues watching a woman be trampled right in front of them. Maya clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to collapse again. She knew she was standing at the edge between being crushed completely and holding on to the last thread of dignity. In her eyes, Scopes was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of arrogance soaked in violence, and if she showed submission now, not only she, but all those silent eyes would be chained tighter by fear. She let out a raspy laugh, throat burning, a faint sound but filled with defiance. It wasn't loud, but it made Scopes' grin falter for a second, as if he'd just heard something he never expected and didn't want to hear. The silence held, but within it a small crack had formed. The crowd's fear remained locked in place, yet deep down they knew that every second of silence turned them into accomplices. Maya, shaken with pain, still used her eyes and that broken laugh to declare that she had not bowed. The desolate gas station in the night had become a witness stand for the confrontation between power and pride, between silenced oppression and a breath still clinging to truth. And this silence, the crowd's quiet surrender, had become the clearest mirror of the cruelty Scopes had just unleashed. In the thick, choking air of the gas station, where silence squeezed every breath, fear had frozen everyone like statues. The truck driver still gripped the steering wheel tight, and the two young men kept their heads down, faces pale with dread. But in the middle of that paralysis, a faint spark suddenly flickered. The young student, baby-faced and still hesitating, reached into his pocket with trembling hands. His breath was shallow, sweat pooling on his forehead, but in his shaking eyes there was something else, something like a decision rising up against his own fear. He swallowed hard, his fingers sliding across the screen, the camera light flickering on. As the dim blue glow lit up, his heart felt like it might explode. But then he drew a deep breath and lifted the phone. The lens unsteady, aimed forward toward Scopes, standing tall on the concrete toward Maya, struggling to lift her head through the pain. The weak light from the phone lit up a grim scene, yet every detail seemed clearer than ever. The lens wobbled in the student's trembling hand, the frame swaying up and down, but still it captured Scopes fully. He was shouting, voice echoing, soaked in liquor and cruelty, a voice no one would forget once they heard it. "This whole town stays quiet because I crush trash like you," he roared, the words bouncing off the metal roof and slamming back like hammers into the ears of everyone present. Every word wasn't just an insult to Maya, but an unfiltered confession of how he saw the community, of the kind of power he believed he could use at will to crush whoever he pleased. In that moment, Maya lifted her face, neon light falling across blood and bruises, lips trembling but clenched tight. Blood smeared her chin and mixed with sweat, but her gaze held a light that made people stop breathing. She didn't scream, didn't fight. She slowly parted her lips, voice calm, each word falling like a hammer against the wall of arrogance Scopes had built. "You'll kneel before the truth you're trying to bury." Her voice hung in the air, not loud but sharp enough to tighten every chest. It wasn't just personal defiance, it was the echo of years spent underfoot, the declaration that truth would not stay buried beneath anyone's boot. Scopes hesitated for a split second, a flicker of doubt crossing his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. He let out a dry laugh, then roared to drown out the brief disturbance. He lunged forward, fist clenched tight, and suddenly slammed it into the gas pump next to Maya. The clang of metal rang out violently, shaking the air like thunder cracking over the empty lot. The pump trembled, paint flaking off with a long scraping sound. Scopes gritted his teeth, his face twisted with malice, veins bulging at his neck. He growled, his voice echoing like a brutal sentence, "You'll remember this night for the rest of your life." Each word hit the concrete like a blade, making the already thick air nearly unbearable. The truck driver felt his hands tremble uncontrollably. His gaze scattered, caught between fear and fury. He saw a woman being trampled, saw cruelty unfolding in front of him, yet his legs refused to move. The two young men stood frozen, lips parted as if to speak, but their throats closed shut. They knew any move could make them the next target, yet their silence had already become witness to a twisted truth. In the dark weight of that fear, the student's trembling phone was still recording its lens, capturing every second that was the first spark. Maya slumped over, arms still clutching her stomach, but her eyes remained lit untouched by the blow meant to silence her. That look made the chests of those nearby tighten. She didn't scream, didn't beg, but with just a single sentence, a single stare, she tore through the silence that had closed in. Scopes didn't realize that his aggression had become evidence. He arrogantly believed the punch to the pump would make her collapse in fear. But he didn't know that in this moment, every movement, every shout, every twisted grin of his was being recorded, each one a piece of truth ready to expose him. Wind swept in from the highway, dragging with it the harsh scent of gasoline, making the scene even harder to breathe. The neon flickered light, flashing bright, then fading, casting a spotlight on both Maya and Scopes, painting two opposite portraits. One of pride through pain, the other of violence wrapped in arrogance. The space between them was only a few steps, but it felt like a deep gulf separating the trampled from the self-appointed law. The silence of the crowd, Scopes' brutality, and Maya's resistance merged into one chaotic image edge, where a fire of defiance was being lit by pain itself. The student took a deep breath, his hand still shaken but his eyes growing more certain. He realized that every second he was recording could be a turning point, could be the one thing that shifted the balance. In that moment, despite the fear, he knew where he stood. The camera kept rolling the lens unstable. The image was clear enough, the sound was sharp enough. Every shout from Scopes, every strained breath from Maya, every drop of blood on her face was being preserved, ready to become the spark waiting to ignite. That night, the deserted gas station was no longer just an anonymous stop on the highway. It had become the scene of a confrontation between arrogance and truth. Maya, though in pain, still held her head up, her eyes like a small light in the darkness, casting a path forward for those still silent. And from within the shadows, that trembling phone was preserving the evidence, holding on to the flame of resistance that had just been lit. In Scopes' mocking laughter and Maya's labored breathing in the crowd's quiet, something had begun to shift like embers glowing beneath the surface, ready to burn through every lie. In the darkness, still thick with gasoline fumes and Scopes' raspy laughter, the young student backed into a shadowed corner, heart-pounding hands trembling with fear. His eyes kept darting toward the officer standing defiantly in the empty lot, but they also stayed locked on the phone screen where the freshly recorded video replayed in preview mode. Scopes' growling voice echoed from the speaker, his words like an animal's snarl. "I'm the law here." The line burst from the phone, tightening the student's chest. He bit his lip, fully aware that if the clip stayed on his device, everything he had just witnessed would soon be buried, left to vanish, with only a few scattered witnesses knowing what had truly happened. A bold decision flared up, drowning out the fear. His finger tapped hard on the social media icon, pulling up his personal page. The screen glowed in the dark, casting light on a face still wet with sweat. The caption was typed quickly, short, but sharp as a blade. "Racist cop kicks black woman at gas station." No added explanation, just the 1-minute video. His heart felt like it might leap out of his chest as he hit the upload button, and in that instant, the first flame ignited in the vast space of the internet. The phone buzzed immediately as views began to climb, first dozens, then hundreds, then rapidly into the thousands. The first person to share it added a blunt caption: "This is America in 2025. The words spread amplified by the algorithm's spin, while Scopes stood tall at the station, certain that his power remained untouched in another realm. His image was already placed under judgment by tens of thousands of eyes. The audio in the clip became fuel. The line, "I'm the law here," rang out clearly, every gritty syllable from Scopes hitting a nerve in the online crowd. People didn't need to know who Maya was or how it began. Hearing that one sentence was enough to ignite outrage. One of the first comments read, "This is undeniable proof of a broken system." Another followed, "Every word he says makes my skin crawl. This isn't law enforcement, this is a thug in uniform." The anger spread fast like wildfire catching the dry forest. Within minutes, the hashtag Justice for Maya appeared. At first, it showed up in scattered posts, but then it was repeated, expanded, and linked across countless accounts. People who had experienced or witnessed racial discrimination began attaching their own stories, turning the hashtag into a collective archive of memory. "I've been treated like her, pushed out of a store because of my skin. Watching this today, I felt my own pain," one post read. Another followed, "Justice for Maya isn't just for her, it's for all of us." While Maya still struggled to breathe under the neon lights out there, her name had become the symbol of a rising wave. The student's phone kept buzzing, share counts skyrocketing, the numbers jumping so fast he could hardly believe what he was seeing. The clip spread to other platforms, moved to TikTok, Reddit, and through private and public groups alike. An independent media channel reposted it with a cutting caption, "This is the true face of those who claim to serve and protect." The image of Scopes kicking Maya, his flushed face and cruel words ringing out, became undeniable proof of brutality. Elsewhere, in a small apartment, an account with a massive following, tweeted a short, pointed line, "3 minutes from now, he'll pay. Watch." The words lit a second match, drawing thousands more eyes to the video. People began speculating, rewinding, and analyzing. What happens in 3 minutes? Does someone stop him? The mix of curiosity and outrage made the video loop endlessly. Each frame examined every detail magnified. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, Scopes had no idea that every move, every word, had already spilled beyond that small, dimly lit space. He still believed the crowd's silence proved his power, that fear would keep everyone in line. But outside, that silence was gone. In its place was the roar of tens of thousands of people, eyes locked on him, eyes that wouldn't blink away at a single, threatening glance. Maya remained slumped, lips bloodied, breath ragged. She had no idea that her name was being spoken everywhere, that her bloodied face had become the symbol of a rising fury. In the moment, she lifted her head, neon light catching the fire still in her eyes. The image was captured and shared, becoming the portrait of strength in pain. Truth had started to find its voice, sparked by the trembling phone in a young student's hand. In just a few short minutes, the fire online had grown beyond control. News outlets quickly picked up the story, running headlines that screamed, "White cop kicks black woman at gas station." Comments poured in non-stop rage, shock, and a growing call to action. People began organizing protests, and others added the raised fist symbol to their username. It all started from a video recorded with trembling hands, now turned into the match that lit a storm. Scopes kept smirking, convinced the night would end, like all the others, that his threats would be swallowed by the dark. He didn't know that outside the clock had started ticking. With every passing second, thousands of eyes were locked on him, thousands of keystrokes turning his arrogance into exposed guilt. And within the words, "3 minutes from now he'll pay," a silent promise was spreading, turning fury into faith that justice wouldn't wait until morning. It would come the moment the world saw the truth. The night stayed pitch black, the gas station still eerily quiet, but the world beyond it was no longer silent. A fire had been lit, and from now on, Maya was no longer alone. The truth had lifted off the cold concrete, escaped the rusted tin roof, and surged across social media, where it would become the storm to tear through the arrogance of the man who once believed, "I'm the law." While night still hung thick with cold and gasoline in the small town, the outside world had already erupted like a wildfire. The video from the student's trembling phone was no longer a private recording, it had become a weapon. Every frame, every shout from Deputy Scopes, every ragged breath from Maya spread across Twitter like sparks flying into dry brush. While the moon still hung in the sky, tens of thousands had shared it, and by the time the neon lights at the gas station were still flickering, that number had reached into the millions. In apartments, thousands of miles away, people who had never heard of this town stopped what they were doing, stared at their screens, and froze at the sound of one sentence, "I'm the law here." What had seemed like an offhand threat in the quiet of the night now stood as the clearest evidence of a system's arrogance. The storm only intensified as the video moved to TikTok. There, the pace of the internet was hundreds of times faster, and outrage transformed easily into viral content. Users clipped the moment. Scopes one shouted, "Get on your knees," and looped it hundreds of times in short videos. Some edited his voice over thunderclaps, others turned his words into sarcastic rap beats, and some even placed his image beside notorious dictators. Social media was flooded with ridicule, and those bitter laughs only made the fury spread faster. A line meant to humiliate had become a public joke, stripping away the illusion of power he thought would protect him. In a dark room in a major city, a well-known independent journalist replayed the video again and again. Each time the words, "I'm the law here," echoed, he felt a chill run through him. He opened Twitter and typed a short line, "Name, Scopes. Title, Deputy Sheriff. Question, who's protecting him?" The question rang out like an alarm bell. It wasn't aimed only at Scopes, but at the entire structure that had enabled him. Within minutes, thousands of comments and shares pushed the tweet upward, turning it into a collective demand. began. Each person added details, demanded more answers, and the short post became a public indictment. The silence of his superiors was no longer seen as a shield, it was seen as complicity. Back in the darkness of the gas station, Scopes still believed he was in control. He looked at Maya with contempt, convinced everything would be buried beneath fear and silence. But out there, millions of eyes were no longer quiet. They watched him through their screens, heard every word he barked, and none of them looked away. They zoomed in on his flushed face, mocked it, turned it into a symbol of brutality. Hours ago, no one knew who he was. Now, the name Scopes was everywhere on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and across international forums. The spread reached its peak when the hashtag Big Mistake appeared. It started as a single line under a post, but within hours it climbed to the top of the trending chart. Every time someone typed Big Mistake, it came with the clip of Scopes kicking Maya to the ground with her defiant eyes, with his twisted grin. Each post, each sentence, each meme became a hammer striking at his dignity, turning the night at the gas station into a public trial across social media. People no longer waited for the sheriff or the courts because the community had appointed itself judge and the verdict was signed that very night. Maya still had no idea what was happening outside. She remained slumped, holding her stomach lips bloodied, but her eyes had never looked away. Meanwhile, millions had seen those eyes through a blurry frame. They heard her slow words, "You'll kneel before the truth you're trying to bury." And they repeated it again and again like a mantra etched into collective memory. Across platforms, her words appeared under every video, every image becoming a shared banner for those who had ever faced injustice. From an anonymous gas station, her sentence became an echo crashing through walls, tearing down silence. The online storm wasn't just rage, it was revelation. Those who had been harassed or harmed by Scopes and others like him began to speak, sharing their stories beneath posts about Maya. "He once pulled me over and made me kneel on the roadside. He humiliated me in front of my son." The words poured in, weaving a wide-angle portrait of abuse, and with each account another layer of his disguise was peeled away. No one could deny it anymore as evidence and testimony surged like waves. Scopes still knew nothing of the storm. He believed it would all end in the dark, that within days it would fade into obscurity. But even while the neon still flickered above him, his name had already become a punchline online, stamped with the words, "Big Mistake," like a sentence. And, in his arrogance, he didn't realize that the clock had started ticking, that the time he had left as the one in power was now counted in hours. The online storm had started with a shaky clip, but it didn't stop there. It became a massive wave, pulling in millions of voices, millions of eyes, millions of outraged hearts. The night at the gas station remained dark, but out there the light from millions of screens had exposed the true face of the man who believed he was the law. And before dawn could break, the world had already seen Scopes for who he truly was. A man drunk on power, a symbol of decay and the greatest mistake of the system he once believed would protect him. The next morning, before the sun had a chance to burn off the thick fog clinging to the roadside trees, the entire small town was shaken by a storm of information. News broadcasts opened with bold red headlines. The video of Scopes kicking Maya appeared everywhere, and alongside it was the question that struck like a blade. How many more Mayas will be kicked down? That sentence flashed across phone screens, on digital billboards downtown, on hastily pasted posters along crowded streets. It was no longer just a question, it had become a direct challenge to the entire system, forcing it to face the very darkness it had long allowed to grow. Long-standing human rights organizations jumped in at once. On their homepages, the video of Maya collapsing on the pavement spread at lightning speed. Veteran activists spoke out their voices, a mix of outrage and resolve. "We've said for years that systemic abuse is real. This video is living proof. If nothing changes, how many more Mayas will there be?" Thousands of comments flooded in. People weren't just talking about Maya anymore. They were sharing their own stories about being humiliated, pushed aside, pulled over simply because of their skin color. A middle-aged man wrote, "He did this to me. He made me lie on the curb in front of my son just because I questioned his ridiculous demand." A woman added, "Last year, he stopped my car, looked me in the eyes, and said I didn't deserve to sit in that vehicle. I stayed silent out of fear, but today I can't be silent anymore." Each account was posted online, strung together into a long chain of painful memories, creating a living archive that no denial could erase. The image of Scopes and his actions was no longer scattered fragments. It was a full map marked with the footprints of abuse. Meanwhile, national television joined the conversation. The morning news aired the video unblurred, letting the public witness Maya being kicked to the ground and hear Scopes yelling, "Get on your knees!" The sound echoed through living rooms, causing more than a few viewers to drop their coffee and shock eyes wide in disbelief that such a scene could unfold in a modern society. The anchor's voice remained steady, but the tension and outrage in her eyes were barely contained. Legal experts and social activists were brought on air one after another. They broke down the clip second by second, and every one of them reached the same conclusion. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a system that had long fed arrogance into a uniform. The pressure mounted by the hour. Evening talk shows repeatedly replayed images of Maya zooming in on the moment she fell and the unwavering light in her eyes through the pain. Viewers called the hotlines not to ask questions, but to vent their anger. "We've stayed silent too long. It's time for a change." People began gathering groups, coordinated protests, holding signs with bold words, "How many more Mayas?" and "Justice for Maya." The atmosphere on the streets shifted. Ordinary silence was ripped open by chants, by pounding drums, by the footsteps of those who refused to look away. As public outcry intensified, Maya appeared in front of the media for the first time. She sat in a quiet room, a gray curtain behind her, her face still showing signs of fatigue, a bruise visible on one cheek, gauze wrapped around her waist. Yet her eyes were startlingly calm, without a trace of fear. When the camera started rolling, everyone held their breath. Maya looked directly ahead, eyes sharp, voice steady, every word clear. "The kick didn't bring me down, it shook the entire system." The line instantly became a new rallying cry, quoted thousands of times within minutes, printed over photos, chanted in the streets, turned into poems, and displayed in news tickers across digital platforms. Maya's composure had more impact than any speech. People saw in her not just a victim, but a witness, a symbol of resilience. Her words lit a fire, giving strength to those who had endured abuse but never spoken out. Protests spread beyond the small town where it began, reaching major cities. Crowds stood shoulder to shoulder, holding signs printed with Maya's words, intensifying public outrage and leaving authorities with no choice but to pay attention. The sheriff's office received hundreds of calls in a single morning. Angry voices flooded the lines and emails poured into inboxes non-stop. The sheriff was forced to face the press, his expression tense, his voice shaking as he promised a thorough investigation. But vague promises were not enough. The outrage had grown past containment. Crowds gathered in front of City Hall shouting Maya's name, demanding transparency, demanding that the man who had kicked down a woman be held accountable. The pressure wasn't just domestic. International outlets began covering the story. Maya's face appeared on front pages, and her words were translated into multiple languages. A major European paper ran the headline, "One kick shook the whole system." In Asia, a news channel aired the clip and called it undeniable proof that racism still runs deep in American society. The incident quickly surpassed the boundaries of a small town, becoming a global issue, one that the government could no longer ignore. In a private room, Maya quietly watched the images unfold on the screen. She saw her face appear everywhere, saw her words repeated again and again, but there was no pride in her eyes, only reflection. She knew she had stepped into a battle much larger than herself, and that the kick that night was only the beginning. But she also knew that from this point on she was no longer alone. Out there, millions had risen, had turned her pain into collective strength, had transformed one dark night into a torch lighting the way for an entire society. At the police department, the thick gray brick walls that once exuded cold indifference now felt heavier as an emergency meeting was called. The air in the room was thick with the smell of coffee and cigarettes. Familiar faces looked at each other with wary eyes, and a heavy silence lingered until the head officer slammed the table to begin. From the outside, it was clear the department was under intense pressure from the community, but inside these four walls, the storm was no longer coming from the outside. It had exploded from within. One faction insisted on protecting Scopes at all costs, calling him a brother in uniform, arguing that if public pressure could take one of their own down, it would set a dangerous precedent and shake the entire department's credibility. The other side argued that silence and cover-ups were precisely why the public had lost trust, and that failing to prosecute would drown the whole system in outrage. The debate quickly escalated into a tense verbal standoff. A young officer, his face flushed red, slammed his hand on the table, voice tight, firm. "We're staring at the truth. The video is clear. If we keep covering this up, we're no better than accomplices to a crime." Across the table, another officer, known to be close to Scopes, raised an eyebrow mockingly. "You think defending the honor of the department makes us accomplices? If one video can decide a man's fate, then every officer could be ruined by a few edited minutes." The tension was thick enough to feel every heartbeat, and each sentence dropped like a spark into a barrel of oil, pushing the atmosphere to the brink. While the argument had yet to reach any resolution, a deep voice rose from the corner of the room where a veteran officer had sat in silence. He looked around, then lowered his tone, but spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Scopes used to brag about teaching black folks a lesson. I've heard him say it more than once in the locker room that forcing people to kneel was how he kept order. The words hit the room like a hammer, leaving it stunned. A few people exhaled sharply, and others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone understood this was no longer a private matter, but a revelation of the arrogance that had festered for years within their own ranks. Silence hung for a few seconds before it broke into murmurs. People looked at one another with a mix of doubt and unease, asking themselves how many times they had witnessed, heard, or overlooked comments like that. The emergency meeting was no longer just about covering up or pressing charges, but had become a mirror, reflecting all the failures they had let slide for far too long. In the dim light of the room, their tense faces exposed the growing rift, and that fracture was widening, signaling that a collapse could soon come, not just for one man, but for the entire system they once believed was unshakable. In the days following the tense internal meeting, the press began releasing a new series of photos, and this time the public outcry grew even louder. In the published images, Scopes appeared at a loud drinking party with a few close colleagues. White banners with bold red letters hung on the walls bearing blatantly racist slogans. In one frame, he raised a glass with a smug grin, with a mocking phrase aimed at black people visible in the background. Another showed him posing with several men wearing T-shirts printed with an image of a foot stomping down a symbol whose meaning was unmistakable. These photos were no longer just whispers or rumors. They became public evidence of the deep-seated contempt in the man who once wore a police uniform. Major newspapers ran them on their front pages, headlines striking like hammers, Deputy Scopes and the Party of Prejudice. The images spread quickly, triggering a powerful shockwave. If the gas station video had ignited outrage for its blatant violence, the new photos exposed a long-standing rot. The faces at the party, the raised glasses, the triumphant smiles all formed an undeniable portrait of a distorted culture. People no longer saw Scopes as a misguided individual, but as a symbol of a system that had enabled racism. Comments on social media turned harsher, and posts moved beyond mere outrage to calls for direct action. From social media, the fury spilled into the streets. For the first time, those who had only followed the story through screens decided to leave their homes and join the protests. The central square lit up with candlelight, and groups of people stood shoulder to shoulder, raising banners with Maya's image and calls for justice. The beat of drums echoed steadily, each strike like the heartbeat of a community united in anger. Chants rang out, bouncing from one corner to another, swelling into a wave of people demanding truth. Hastily painted flags fluttered, hands clasped tightly, eyes glowing with determination. News networks sent crews to the scene, broadcasting live footage of crowds flooding the long streets, marching and chanting Maya's name. Local police tried to erect barricades, but the sheer number of people was overwhelming, and wave after wave pushed toward City Hall. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke, the sound of shouting, and distant ambulance sirens. The crowd no longer consisted only of those who had faced discrimination, but also students, teachers, doctors, strangers, united in a single voice. The event had evolved into a wide-reaching movement where justice was no longer an abstract concept, but an urgent demand. In the eyes of those who joined, the image of Maya fallen, and then rising, paired with her proud words, had moved beyond that of a victim. It had become a banner leading the way. Alongside it, the series of photos showing Scopes at the drinking party served as the final straw, unleashing a long-simmering fury into a full blaze. Every step taken through the streets, every chant shouted into the night became living proof that society would no longer endure in silence, that the truth had broken free from the screen and turned into a force powerful enough to shatter the silence that had blanketed the years. Amid the streets, still echoing with chants and glowing with protest signs, a new development sent the storm of outrage into a deeper frenzy. The investigative agency was forced to release the surveillance footage from the gas station, and it was immediately broadcast on every major news network. Every frame was chillingly clear, with no detail blurred, from the moment Deputy Scopes lunged forward to grab Maya's wrist to the brutal kick that dropped her to the concrete, to the hateful glare in his eyes as he shouted into her face. The footage matched 100% with the student's shaky phone video, serving as a final confirmation that nothing had been exaggerated or edited. Those still skeptical fell silent, and those who had defended Scopes could no longer find words to justify him. In a large makeshift press hall, a massive screen lit up, replaying the footage in front of hundreds of citizens, journalists, and even local officials. When Scopes' voice rang out, raspy and arrogant, "I'm the law here," the entire room shook. The murmurs turned into waves of fury, which quickly swelled into cries of outrage. Some people broke down in tears hearing those words again, as they triggered memories of being trampled, of pain long dismissed. No one could stay seated, and no one could endure hearing such brutal words shouted by a man in uniform at a woman who had already fallen. Out on the streets, large public screens also began broadcasting the footage. Crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder, many clutching their heads in disbelief, others clenching fists in fury. As those words echoed again through loudspeakers, the crowd erupted like a crashing wave. They shouted back, voices merging into a thunderous chorus. Signs were raised once more, but now they were more than slogans. They were oaths, declarations that this would not be forgotten. Street corners pulsed with drum beats, and small groups fell into line, united in a single rhythm of anger. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was even heavier. Officers sat facing each other, their expressions hollow, as the evidence was now undeniable. There was no hiding it, no way to twist it into something favorable. One sighed and shook his head, admitting that this was the moment the entire system was being held to the mirror. Scopes, who once believed the silence of his colleagues and the fear of the public would protect him, had now become the burden threatening to drag the entire institution into collapse. Public outrage surged as international media outlets simultaneously replayed the footage, each bearing a headline that cut deep: "Police officer declares himself the law." the words sliced like a knife exposing a truth too bitter to ignore. In cafes, schools, and offices, people debated fiercely, their tones a mix of anger and scorn. No one dared defend him anymore. No one could look away. The evidence had been dragged into the light, and its power lay not in its length just a few minutes, but in how it turned a moment of violence into a collective indictment of arrogance, awakening a unified demand for justice across the entire community. In the central square, once only a place for hurried footsteps, a sea of protesters now flooded the space. Flags and banners soared, drums pounded, chants roared louder than the sirens in the distance. The crowd rose in unison to shout a new slogan. 3 minutes later, karma. Thousands of voices fused into one, echoing off tall buildings and reaching every corner of the city. The chant was more than mockery. It was a warning, a reminder that the moment he kicked Maya down was also the moment his fate was sealed. With each repetition, the pride in the eyes of those on the streets became more visible. They weren't shouting just to condemn one man, but to send a message to the entire system that had allowed it to happen. Reporters squeezed through the crowd, cameras sweeping from the fiery faces of young people to the weathered hands of elders still raising their signs high. They captured the moment when public outrage became collective power. On live television, the chant 3 minutes later, karma echoed nationwide, leaving home audiences speechless, some in tears, others with fists clenched. Analysts noted that never before had unity erupted this fast and this fiercely, all triggered by one brief moment that laid bare an undeniable truth. Meanwhile, in the quiet suburb where Scopes had taken refuge, the atmosphere was the exact opposite. Since early morning, reporters had gathered news vans parked at the gate lenses, aimed squarely at the sealed front door. Knocks thundered again and again, voices calling his name rang through every room. On the massive screen, just outside the news ticker, scrolled relentlessly, "Racist Cop of the Year." The phrase became a merciless label, stamped on the front pages of newspapers, played on repeat across networks, turning Scopes from a once arrogant officer into a national embarrassment and laughingstock. Scopes peered through the gap in the curtain, the glow from the camera lights casting pale shadows across his face. His heart pounded erratically, and his trembling hand clutched the fabric tightly, but it couldn't block out the fear. He saw the signs outside his home, heard the angry voices rising, the loudspeakers replaying his own words from that night. "I am the law here," now echoed outside his doorstep, turned into cold, undeniable proof exposing the truth he had once tried to bury. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogance and confidence gone, replaced by the feeling of being trapped within the very walls of his own house. From a man once so sure the public would forget, Scopes was now surrounded by that very public. Reporters kept calling, questions came non-stop, and news outlets live-streamed every angle of the scene outside his door. Every time he heard someone yell, 3 minutes later, karma, he flinched as if the words themselves were ticking down to an inevitable collapse. The image of Scopes trembling inside stood in stark contrast to the thousands standing tall in the streets, and that contrast became the clearest sign that the balance of power had shifted. While the protests in the streets showed no signs of slowing inside the system, a significant shift had begun. The Internal Affairs Committee of the Police Department was forced to take action with no way to dodge the mounting pressure from public outrage and the evidence now laid bare. The investigation opened under intense scrutiny, and old case files on Scopes were pulled from drawers long locked and coated with dust. Investigators turned page after page, examined every report, and gradually a long chain of irregular incidents emerged like stains that could not be washed away. No longer scattered rumors or isolated testimonies, these became a systematic body of evidence, revealing that violence and abuse of power were not isolated acts but habits long nurtured. In those files, multiple cases of coercive interrogation surfaced. In one case, Scopes was accused of detaining a young black man beyond the legal limit, forcing him to sign a confession through blatant threats. Another report described a teenager stopped late at night, handcuffed and locked in a patrol car for hours without a warrant. The more they uncovered, the longer the list grew, with victim after victim, named all sharing one thing in common: they were people of color targeted under a gaze steeped in prejudice. The dry language of the reports concealed a heavy truth, where the man in uniform had long acted as though the law was his to wield. The committee went beyond paper records, reaching out to former complainants who had once filed reports, only to withdraw under pressure. In a small apartment, a middle-aged man trembled as he recalled an old memory. He recounted being slapped in the face by Scopes for reacting to an unjustified traffic stop, then jailed overnight for disturbing the peace. Another woman, her voice cracking, remembered being pulled over with her young daughter shouted at her car, ransacked, and forced to kneel by the roadside. She could still see the terror in her child's eyes, a memory that haunted her to this day. These testimonies kept coming, recorded and filmed, all added to the new case file, lending even greater weight to the investigation. The committee's preliminary report showed that this was not a matter of a few isolated incidents, but a sustained pattern of violent behavior. The truth emerged that Scopes had been formally complained about multiple times, yet the cases were buried in silence or brushed aside by superiors. Old reports, vague and brief with notes like insufficient evidence or handled internally, now served as indictments against the system itself. In a closed conference room, investigators exchanged heavy glances, knowing the case had moved beyond one man to implicate an entire institution. The public followed every development with a thirst for justice. Each leaked detail about the investigation's findings only fueled the rising wave of outrage. People began chanting a new slogan during marches: "Open the files, deliver justice." Conversations in schools, coffee shops, and on public transport all revolved around the story of Scopes. No one believed anymore that this was just the affair of a small town. The stains in his record had become undeniable evidence, forcing the system to confront the truth. The investigation was no longer about holding one officer accountable, but about exposing an entire mechanism of concealment, and that was what society truly expected to change. During testimony collection, the internal committee reached out to a witness who had appeared in case files years earlier, though the incident had been hastily summarized and quickly buried. The man, now in his 40s, bore the marks of time on his face and still trembled, recalling a moment nearly a decade ago. He recounted how on his way home from work, Scopes had stopped his car, forced him out, and conducted a search without reason. When he objected, a kick to the chest sent him sprawling into the roadside mud. The humiliation wasn't just in the fall, but in the shouted insult that followed: "Black men belong underfoot." The words silenced the interrogation room, the air thickened, and investigators exchanged tense glances. The detail aligned exactly with the recent footage showing Scopes using a kick to demean Maya. The man spoke slowly, each word unburdening a weight he had carried for years. He admitted he hadn't pursued the case back then, afraid of retaliation, drained of any faith in justice. But after seeing Maya collapse on concrete and watching the community rise, he knew he had to speak. His statement was recorded, signed, and immediately added to the file, becoming clear proof of a repeated pattern, a long chain of racially motivated abuse. His words were no longer just personal trauma. They became a knife, slicing through the final layer of Scopes' disguise, revealing the man's true nature. News of the testimony spread quickly, picked up by media outlets, and the public once again erupted in anger. The story was shared alongside Maya's video with comparisons between the two events years apart to show that these brutal acts were nothing new. What began as a shocking incident now stood as a full dossier on a repeat offender, shielded time and again again by the very system meant to hold him accountable. Discussions exploded across forums, and the public began asking hard questions about the responsibility of the commanders who had once looked away. Under growing public pressure and mounting evidence, the decision to suspend Scopes was finally issued. The official announcement was delivered to the press during a brief conference where the police chief bowed his head and read from a statement voice tense. To ensure transparency, Deputy Scopes will be suspended until final conclusion is reached. The dry wording of the notice marked a turning point as it showed that legal pressure had forced the system to act. Outside the station, the crowd erupted, applause thundered, people embraced in a moment of temporary relief. They saw it as an initial victory, even as they knew the road to justice remained long. Inside the house, surrounded by reporters, Scopes quietly shut the door, his hands clenched and restless, his face pale. He had once grown used to the fearful stares of others, but now those stares had turned into the cold judgment of an entire community. For the first time in years, he could feel the weight of justice closing in with no way out, no shield to hide behind. And, in the chants, echoing from the street the words. 3 minutes later, karma rang like a relentless reminder signaling that his collapse was drawn near. After Scopes' suspension, the atmosphere in the city didn't settle. Instead, it grew even more tense. At Maya's attorney's office, stacks of documents piled high on the desk, each page a piece of evidence compiled from the video footage, witness statements, and Scopes' old record. Maya's lead attorney, a veteran of civil rights litigation, stepped before the press with a determined look, holding a thick file and announcing that an official lawsuit had been filed. He said this wasn't just a civil suit, but a legal battle to determine the responsibility of an individual who had abused his power and the system that enabled him. That statement rang out like a bell, marking the moment justice moved from the streets into the courtroom. News of the lawsuit spread quickly. Media outlets updated continuously, and television stations aired footage of Maya and her lawyer entering the courthouse to file. Crowds lined the sidewalks, many raising their phones to film. Applause broke out as Maya stepped out of the car, still bearing signs of exhaustion, but with a steady gaze. The feeling of anticipation hung heavy in everyone's hearts because they knew this was no longer a personal matter. It was a turning point to prove that the law could in fact challenge the rot within its own ranks. The next day, crowds flooded the entrance to the county courthouse. Banners filled the square and large signs bearing justice. For Maya appeared everywhere. The atmosphere was solemn yet electric, each chant echoing off the courthouse's aging stone walls, turning the normally silent place into a battlefield. On the steps stood students, workers, mothers with young children, elderly people with silver hair, all with eyes fixed on the towering wooden doors. They didn't know what would unfold inside, but their presence sent a message. This time, society would not look away. Inside, court staff moved quickly, carefully stacking case files and reviewing witness lists. Security presence was heavy, the tension thick, like the moments before a historic trial. International news outlets had sent crews to the square, setting up cameras for live broadcasts. Images of small flags bearing justice for Maya fluttering in the breeze were transmitted worldwide, turning Maya's name from a local matter into a global symbol in the fight against injustice. Amid the crowd gathered outside the courthouse, Maya appeared surrounded by her lawyer and activists. Still wearing bandages across her abdomen, she walked with firm, deliberate steps, not fast, but full of resolve. People along the path wept at the sight of her. Some reached out toward her as if to pass her strength. Maya said nothing, only gave a slight nod, a faint smile, but her eyes blazed. Her presence alone sent the crowd into a roar, thunderous applause, screams, sea, and chants swelling like a storm. In that moment, no one doubted any more that this lawsuit had moved far beyond the bounds of a typical legal case. It had become the symbol of a movement where a single kick failed to bury a person and instead ignited the hearts of millions. And as the courtroom doors slowly closed behind Maya, Society understood that the next battle had begun, and this time justice would be tested on the very ground where Scopes once believed he stood above all. That morning, a thick layer of gray clouds covered the sky, and a cold wind swept across the square in front of the courthouse where thousands had gathered early. The chants kept echoing off the ancient stone walls, the sound like a drumbeat announcing a trial that could no longer be delayed. In that tense air, Maya appeared, her frame thinner after days of injury, a white bandage still wrapped around one arm and standing out in the dim light. She walked slowly but steadily, her face calm, her eyes shining with a quiet, indescribable pride. The crowd erupted in applause. Some people wept at the sight of her, and others raised their signs as if welcoming a living witness to justice. Maya didn't need many words through her steady gaze and faint smile. She delivered a powerful sense that the truth could not be buried. In stark contrast, when a different door opened, Deputy Scopes entered the courthouse surrounded by a few police officers. He still wore a dark suit, but his face looked worn down as if ground away by sleepless nights. His eyes were dull, darting around the lobby before quickly dropping to avoid the cameras aimed his way. Chants of protest roared his name, was called out directly, and signs with mocking slogans were held high. Under that pressure, Scopes shortened his stride, trying to hurry through the hallway, but the cameras still caught his tense face. Lips pressed tight, the clear look of unease. He couldn't look straight ahead, couldn't face the public, and that only fueled the crowd's outrage. The contrast between Maya and Scopes was broadcast live by reporters. On screen, people saw a wounded yet proud woman standing tall as a symbol of resilience, and a man who once claimed the right to dominate, now shrinking from the public's gaze. Noon broadcasts aired the footage, remarking that the difference in how the two entered the courthouse made it clear where the scales of justice were tipping. Viewers at home could feel the shift. The victim walked into court with dignity, while the accused entered in disgrace. Inside the courtroom, a solemn atmosphere settled over the room. Maya sat beside her lawyer, eyes, focused hands neatly placed on the table, her face showing no sign of fear. Scopes sat across from her shoulders, slightly hunched, occasionally leaning in to whisper to his attorney, but his eyes constantly avoided both the cameras and the gaze from across the aisle. The entire courtroom watched the two figures, sensing clearly that this confrontation was no longer just between two individuals, but between truth and arrogance, between dignity and concealment. Outside, the crowd stood steady under a light drizzle, their chants echoing rhythmically, as if sending Maya strength with every passing moment. The moment both appeared in court marked a major turning point in the case. If, until now, the story had mostly unfolded on the streets and across social media, it had now fully entered the legal arena, where every piece of evidence and every testimony would be weighed in public view. The image of Maya, with her white bandages and proud gaze, became the focal point of media coverage, while Scopes, scowling and ducking his head from the cameras, became a vivid representation of collapse. And in the dim courtroom light, it was clear to all that this trial would not merely determine the fate of one man, but serve as a test for an entire system already trembling under the storm of justice. Inside the packed courtroom, the tension was palpable from the very first minutes. When the prosecutor requested that the video be played, all eyes turned to the large screen at the center of the room. Scope's voice rang out, "Get up, you piece of trash!" Each word echoing off the stone walls, freezing many in the gallery. That growl tore open an old wound in memory, and no one could sit still. Some in the audience gripped the armrest tightly, faces flushed with anger, while others broke down in tears as they watched Maya collapse, her body curling in pain. The camera panned slowly across the courtroom, capturing every furious glance, every tear, every heavy breath, showing that the power of evidence didn't lie in numbers, but in the real emotions it stirred. Scopes sat at the defendant's table, his face taut, hands clenched, though his eyes still flickered with defiance. When his defense attorney rose, Scopes nodded slightly and spoke in a hoarse voice, trying to stay calm. She resisted. I had to subdue her. The words dropped into the room instantly, triggering murmurs of disapproval. Spectators exchanged looks, and a wave of headshakes rolled through the room like an undertow. Across the aisle, Maya sat with her bandaged hand resting on her thigh, her gaze locked on the man who had just uttered that excuse. In her eye there was no fear, only calm, mingled with tightly restrained pain, as if she were watching a clumsy play that Scopes was staging in a last attempt to escape the truth. The prosecutor stood sharply, voice firm, repeating Scopes's words with biting sarcasm. Subdue her by kicking a woman who had already collapsed on concrete. He turned to the jury, eyes resolute, pointing to the screen where the image of the kick was still frozen. Is this restraint, or is this the thrill of violence? The question cut through the courtroom like a blade slashing away the flimsy layer of justification the defendant tried to wear. Scopes shifted in his seat, attempting to protest, but his voice shook, stripped of its usual certainty. He looked around, catching the jury's and public's cold stares, the kind of stares that pressed his back to the wall. Outside the courtroom, chants from the crowd roared through the thick doors. They couldn't hear every word of the hearing, but their anger and resolve became the background soundtrack of the trial. Inside, every question, every replayed clip, every feeble justification from Scopes felt drowned out by the force of truth. Everyone understood this hearing wasn't just about a single act, but a confrontation between justice and deceit, between undeniable truth and crumbling excuses. And in Maya's steady gaze and each heavy breath of those watching it was clear the balance had begun to tip, not toward the man who wore the badge, but toward the truth now speaking louder than ever. The entire courtroom fell silent as Maya slowly stood up. She lightly placed her hand on the table to steady herself, the white bandage on her arm, stark against the bright lights, her face still bearing traces of fatigue, but her eyes burning with unwavering resolve. The dry scrape of a chair echoed through the room, drawing every gaze toward her. Maya's voice rang out, not loud, but firm, each word clear. You call. Kicking a woman who's already collapsed. Restraint. That question cut through the already tense atmosphere, shaking the courtroom to its core. Each sentence she spoke carried the weight not of a plea, but of a reality no one could deny. Maya's eyes swept across the jury, the gallery, and finally rested on Scopes' frozen expression. In that moment, the confrontation was no longer between a woman and an officer, but between truth and justification. Some in the gallery nodded subtly, others clenched their fists in silent agreement. A few scattered claps rose from the back, quickly silenced by the sharp pounding of the judge's gavel. The sound struck with deliberate rhythm as if to remind the court of its decorum, yet no one could ignore the shift in energy that swept the room after her words. Scopes sat at the defendant's table, his face flushed, his hands clenched tight. He made a motion to rise in protest, but his voice caught his eyes, darting around only to meet the jury's cold stares. Maya's upright stance and steady voice had rendered his earlier defenses hollow. He dropped his head, lips pressed tight, trying to avoid the heavy gaze now fixed on him. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the courtroom grew heavier. Even the sound of tense breathing and soft paper shuffling echoed in the oppressive silence. Outside, the crowd's chants filtered in a steady rhythm, underlining the hearing and amplifying the pressure within. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly, his voice stern and demanding order, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes when looking at Maya. Her question had gone beyond rebuttal. It had become a challenge to the entire system, asking whether justice could truly tolerate such a distortion of truth. The hearing continued, but from that moment on the tone had shifted. Maya was no longer the silent figure enduring it all. She had risen, forcing everyone to confront the unavoidable question. The air was stifling, the gavel struck an urgency, tension filled the room, but with it came a quiet sense of belief spreading through those who witnessed it, that justice was beginning to find its voice through the pride of the woman who had once been kicked to the ground. After the tense exchange between Maya and Scopes, the prosecutor called the first witness to the stand. The young college student who had recorded the video walked up with a nervous gait, but eyes full of resolve. In the courtroom, every gaze turned toward him as if the trembling hands that held the phone that night had sparked the fire of justice burning today. When the judge asked him to recount the event, his voice trembled at first but grew clearer with each word. He described every second in detail from the moment Scopes approached Maya, his shouting echoing to the kick that folded her body and slammed her to the concrete. He emphasized that Maya had not resisted in any way. She was simply pumping gas, trying to stay calm under threat. Each word landed like an arrow piercing the flimsy defense Scopes had built, and the tension in the courtroom thickened. Murmurs of agreement rose from the gallery as the truth came to life through the steady voice of a first-hand witness. Immediately after, the prosecutor called the gas station attendant to the stand. The middle-aged man kept his head down, his hands twisting together as if searching for something to grip. His eyes avoided the camera, but when he caught sight of Maya sitting in the front row, there was a flicker of emotion. The judge encouraged him to speak the truth, and after a long pause, his voice finally emerged soft but clear. "I was afraid. But the truth is, she didn't fight back." The courtroom froze, many people leaning in to catch every word. The man went on saying that he had drawn the blinds that night out of fear, but through a gap he had seen everything. Maya had stood still, showing no aggression, while Scopes used force as a display of authority. He admitted his cowardice, saying he should have spoken up sooner, but today he could no longer stay silent. That confession landed like a heavy blow to Scopes' defense. The jurors' faces grew stern, their expressions registering the undeniable consistency between a direct witness and a third-party observer Maya had not resisted. Scopes sat rigid, his hands clenched tight, his face dark. He tried to turn to his lawyer, but his agitation was so visible that no explanation could possibly cover it. The courtroom held its breath, each word from the witness tipping the scales of justice a little further. Outside, the chants from the crowd continued to filter in, mixing with the dense atmosphere inside to create immense pressure. Everyone understood this trial was no longer just about a single kick. It was unveiling a long-buried string of truths. And in the moment the gas station attendant confessed, many eyes in the courtroom filled with tears, for they saw courage reclaimed from fear, and that was the turning point that pushed justice one step closer to the truth. After the student and the gas station attendant had spoken, the prosecutor called another witness into the courtroom. This time it was a retired police officer, his hair white, his frame tall and lean, but his eyes still sharp with the firmness of someone who had spent many years in the force. He walked slowly to the witness stand, each step carrying weight, and the entire room fell into complete silence. When the judge asked him to speak, he took a deep breath, looked directly at the jury, then pointed to the defendant, his voice raspy but firm. "Scopes is a man who used the name of the law to humiliate black people." The statement struck like a hammer blow, causing every eye in the courtroom to turn toward Scopes. This was no longer an accusation from civilians, but from someone who had worn the same badge, and his words carried a weight that the entire system could no longer ignore. The retired officer recounted that years ago, during his time on the force, he had witnessed Scopes repeatedly displaying contempt toward black individuals during patrols. He often boasted about his actions, treating the act of forcing others to kneel as a demonstration of power. The man admitted that he regretted not speaking up sooner for having stayed silent in the face of such degrading words and behavior. Now, his voice laced with bitterness, he said that his silence had helped someone like Scopes rise unchecked through the ranks. His testimony cast a heavy shadow across the courtroom, where many in the gallery nodded, their eyes filled with anger, but also the weight of realizing how long the cover-up had lasted. The prosecutor quickly followed up by presenting a series of reports documenting past complaints, aligning them with the witness's testimony, and pointing out the consistencies. The pages were held up for the jury, each one detailing incidents where Scopes had pulled people over, hurled insults, and even committed physical abuse without facing consequences. The truth, now flowing from multiple sources, became a torrent of evidence, leaving no room for the defendant to deny. The camera panned to Scopes, capturing the shifting expressions on his face, his lips pressed tightly while the corners of his eyes twitched uncontrollably. Scopes could not sit still. His fingers tapped against the desk, then wiped across his face, sweat dotting his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. He leaned toward his defense attorney, whispering urgently, but his counsel remained silent, face darkened as if there was nothing left to grasp. When the prosecutor began to fire a series of short, direct questions, Scopes stumbled through his answers, his voice cracking, sometimes pausing mid-sentence with no response. The jury watched his every reaction, taking notes steadily, while the spectators made no effort to hide their contempt. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened, each accusation, each new piece of evidence stacked like stones on Scopes' shoulders. He grew increasingly flustered, breathing rapidly, eyes darting around in search of an escape that no longer existed. The man who once arrogantly claimed to be the law now appeared helpless before the truth, so unsettled he kept his head down to avoid the judgmental stares. And in that courtroom, everyone could clearly sense that his mask of authority had finally fallen, revealing the true face of a man who wore the badge but stood as a stain on the entire system. On the day of sentencing, heavy clouds blanketed the city sky, but the square in front of the courthouse glowed with the presence of a packed crowd, all waiting for the moment of judgment. Inside the courtroom, tension was palpable. Every breath quickened, every gaze locked onto the elevated bench where the judge sat. He turned the file one last time, his steady voice echoing in the stillness. The court finds Deputy Scopes guilty of racially motivated assault. The words landed like a gavel strike, heavy and final, shaking the entire courtroom. Scopes sat frozen, face pale, hands trembling uncontrollably, breath caught in his chest as if unable to believe the day had finally come when he would stand convicted. At that very moment, cheers erupted outside, merging with thunderous applause inside the courtroom. People rose to their feet, many clasping hands tightly, others weeping at the sound of the verdict. From the streets, the chant, "Justice." For Maya echoed in waves, striking the courthouse walls and rippling out across the city. Reporters scrambled to capture every frame, lenses fixed on the scene as a community exploded with emotion, their long-suppressed fury finally released. Amid the noise, all eyes turned to Maya, the woman seated calmly in the courtroom, lips pressed tight, her eyes gleaming with pride. That scene was broadcast live across the country. On TV screens and small homes, the chant, "Justice" for Maya brought viewers to their feet, clapping, some hugging their children, others silently wiping away tears. On social media, the phrase spread like wildfire, turning the trial into a historic moment where justice ceased to be a slogan and became real. Those who once doubted that truth could prevail now stood silent, having witnessed a system brought to its knees by evidence and by public pressure. Scopes shrank in the defendant's chair, his face weighed down, eyes drifting like a man stripped of all support. The image stood in stark contrast to the crowd still roaring outside. Across from him, Maya gave a slight nod, a message, not only to Scopes, but to anyone who ever believed power could bury the truth. She didn't need to shout or gloat. Her calm presence alone delivered the clearest answer to a long road of pain and defiance. The verdict was etched into history as a victory for justice, but also as a wake-up call. It wasn't just the end for one corrupt officer, but the beginning of renewed belief that when truth is exposed, a community can turn outrage into strength and pain into a collective voice. And in the echoing chants across the square, people understood that the kick meant to humiliate had instead rebounded, shaking an entire system and forcing it to face its long-hidden darkness. Amid the waves of cheers rolling in from the streets into the courtroom, Maya remained seated, her hands clasped on the wooden table, her posture calm like a lake after a storm. Her eyes shone not with the pride of a victor, but with the gentle, steady light of someone who had walked through pain and found belief again. On her face, still bearing traces of exhaustion, a faint smile appeared, small, yet enough to move many in the courtroom. It wasn't a smile of vengeance, but a quiet acknowledgement that justice had finally arrived, that the blood, the broken breaths in that dark night had not been in vain. A few spectators wept as they met Maya's unwavering gaze, because in that moment she was no longer just a victim, but a symbol of resilience for an entire community. In stark contrast, just a few steps away, Scopes sat with a darkened face, his eyes cast downward, his body slumped as if drained of life. When the judge finished speaking, he bowed his head, once held arrogantly high, now lowered his shoulders, trembling as he struggled to maintain composure. Only a few months prior, he had worn the sheriff's uniform with arrogance, standing tall in the streets, believing he embodied the law. But in that brief moment, the mask of power was completely stripped away, and before everyone, he was nothing more than a convicted man. The transformation was so sudden that it left the observers breathless. A man who once inspired fear, now reduced to a figure of collapse, isolation, and pity. Cameras captured the image clearly, broadcasting it live to the square outside where thousands stood, packed tightly under a light drizzle. When they saw Scopes bow his head, the crowd erupted into applause, the chant, "Justice," for Maya rising again, this time not with anger, but with relief and release. They had witnessed in real time the reversal of power, as the one who once mocked the law now bowed before its judgment. The cheers surged like a massive chorus, shaking the streets around them. Elders embraced their grandchildren, students gripped each other's hands, and in every shout there was a sense that this was a moment they would carry forever. Inside the courtroom, Maya's lawyer turned slightly toward his client, offering a modest smile that remained respectful. Reporters scribbled nonstop, cameras missed nothing. Some jurors looked at Maya with reverence, knowing that today's verdict wasn't based on law alone, but also on the strength she had embodied throughout. At the bench, the judge struck the gavel once more to close the trial, the sound echoing through the room, marking a historic moment where justice had finally spoken. Maya sat still, holding on to that faint smile as if bidding farewell to a painful chapter while quietly opening a new one. In her radiant eyes there was faith, pride, and an unspoken message to those who once stayed silent: stand up, because justice is never in vain. Scopes, meanwhile, slumped in the defendant's chair, utterly alone. The self-proclaimed sheriff, now a convicted man judged by the very law he once claimed to embody. In that moment, the contrast between two people, two fates, two symbols, was etched deeply like a wordless painting where truth had finally triumphed over arrogant darkness. After the verdict was delivered, its reverberations did not stop at the courtroom or the protests in the streets, but quickly seeped into social life in various ways. At universities, the video of the incident was inserted directly into human rights curricula, becoming a real-life case study of what students must confront, not just through textbooks. In wide lecture halls, light projected the footage onto giant screens the moment Maya was kicked down and then stood back up in pain, playing clearly silencing the entire class. Students in the front row bowed their heads to take notes, and others looked up, their eyes flashing with anger mixed with reflection. No one saw the case as just a passing headline anymore, but as part of a larger lesson on responsibility and courage. The professor stepped into the middle of the room, voice calm but firm, his gaze sweeping across each student's face. He pointed at the screen and said, "One kick can bring a person down, but it can also wake a society up." The sentence echoed through the hall, triggering a profound silence. Students understood that the kick did not just hurt Maya. It had awakened millions, forcing them to re-examine the unjust structures that had existed for too long. Dozens of hands shot up to speak, sparking a wave of debate. Some called it proof of systemic failure, while others saw it as a chance for reform, a push toward a fairer foundation. The discussions continued long after class. Students gathered in hallways still arguing their points, some replaying the video on their phones and pointing to specific moments to reinforce their views. Those conversations spread to other classrooms, became topics in civics law and sociology lectures. In dormitories, coffee shops near campus, and even online, students used the video as the centerpiece for essays, arguments, and research projects. What began as evidence in a court case transformed into an educational tool, a reminder that truth can reshape the awareness of an entire generation. At the same time, other educational institutions use the event as a highlight in seminars and public talks. Experts emphasize that human rights are not distant ideals, but something deeply tied to everyday actions. They recounted Maya's story as a prime example of how personal pride can become collective strength and how a witness's bravery can open the door to social change. The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement, some quickly jotting down key phrases. From lecture halls to town squares, from classrooms to households, the lessons from the case rippled outward like waves. It reminded people that injustice may bring down an individual, but from that fall, entire communities can awaken and rise. And in the memory of those who witnessed it, the professor's words continue to echo, and Kick didn't just bring Maya down, it forced the whole society to look at itself. In many lecture halls, after the clip was shown, debates erupted. Students sat in groups, hands raised, voices overlapping, each with a different opinion. A young man stood up in the middle of the class, his eyes serious, and asked if no one had recorded it, would justice have come? The question echoed, silencing the room for a moment before the discussion flared up again. Some insisted that visual evidence was the deciding factor, arguing that without the video, the story would likely have been buried like so many others. Others disagreed, saying justice doesn't only depend on a phone, but also on the courage of those who step up and testify. The debate continued, spilling from the lecture hall into the hallway and down to the cafe where students still gathered in groups to discuss. A female student spoke up, her voice shaky but firm, recalling how she once witnessed a friend being stopped by police for no reason but chose to walk away out of fear of trouble. Now, she said she felt regret, believing that the most important thing is not who holds the camera, but who has the courage to act when the truth needs defending. Her words made several students nod in agreement, and others bowed their heads in thought. This event had become more than a legal case. It had sparked a reckoning among the youth about their own roles in upholding justice. They were no longer passive consumers of news, but were beginning to see personal responsibility in taking action and daring to confront injustice when it arises. Student clubs began incorporating the debates into official programming. Human rights forums were organized with the question, if no one had recorded it, would justice have come at the center of the discussion? Many students stood up eagerly to voice their perspectives, citing legal principles, historical cases, and personal experiences. That atmosphere fostered a spirit of learning and critical thinking, making everyone feel part of a larger social dialogue. While these vibrant discussions took place everywhere, Maya chose to sit quietly in a small room. She watched on a screen, seeing footage of classrooms, peaceful protests, and student forums replayed on the news. Her eyes glistened with emotion, her hands resting on her knees, gently clenched as if to hold on to the warmth rising from deep within. She knew the path she had walked was paved with blood and tears, but seeing what was unfolding now, she understood that her sacrifice had not been in vain. In the quiet, Maya realized that she had become a spark of inspiration for generations. She didn't need to speak much. Her presence and her story alone were enough to move millions. The pain she once endured had now transformed into a source of strength for others to be braver. As the glow of the screen lit up her face, she smiled gently, fully knowing she had left an indelible mark on society's journey toward justice. After the tense trials and the verdict delivered, the echoes of the case did not fade into fleeting relief. It became the starting point of a movement that spread more powerfully than ever. Across major cities, countless former victims who had once remained silent now came forward to share their stories. A young man in the South stood in the middle of a public square, his voice trembling but firm, recounting how he had once been stopped without cause, insulted, and searched in the street but had stayed silent out of fear his family would suffer the consequences. A middle-aged woman appeared on the local television, tears streaming down her face as she recalled her 16-year-old son being forced to kneel on the street simply for wearing a dark jacket. Each story told was a piece of a puzzle that, when placed together, formed a full picture of a long simmering issue that had never truly been confronted. Social media became the archive and amplifier for these testimonies. Thousands of new posts emerged, each one a memory, a wound, but also a piece of evidence. Readers responded not only with outrage, but also with comfort, support, and encouragement to rise. Rallies were held where victims stood before crowds and told their stories, greeted by long waves of applause. They were no longer alone, because now one person's courage had sparked a fire that led thousands of others to rise. The feeling of being heard and believed helped them reclaim lost dignity, and it was that very restoration that propelled the wave of change forward with growing force. In response to the urgent need, a respected legal organization launched a fund to protect the vulnerable. The press conference announcing the fund took place in a brightly lit room with dozens of cameras filming and a large crowd in attendance. A spokesperson for the organization declared that their mission was not only to defend individuals, but to build a legal shield for entire communities. They pledged to provide free legal counsel to victims of abuse of power and to monitor cases to ensure none would be buried in silence again. Thunderous applause followed the reading of the commitment, and many shed tears upon learning that they finally had something solid to lean on. The Protection Fund quickly received widespread support. Individuals and businesses donated, artists held benefit concerts, and students volunteered for outreach campaigns. Every donation, every pledge carried with it the hope for a more just society. Within weeks, the fund had gathered enough resources to begin filing class action lawsuits, marking a major milestone in the battle against abuse of power. The atmosphere in society changed day by day, from isolated outrage to organized solidarity. People looked to Maya, to the newly outspoken victims, and realized that change was no longer an illusion. It had begun to take shape not only in the streets but within the halls of the legal system. And from that, trust was restored, the belief that every voice, every story, when raised together, could become a force strong enough to shift the entire system. As new testimonies continued to emerge and the Protection Fund began its work, the community turned to the very place where it all began to turn it into a symbol. The gas station by the highway, once the backdrop of pain and humiliation, had now become a site of remembrance. Each evening, crowds quietly gathered, carrying white candles in their hands. The flickering lights gradually spread, covering the cold concrete yard where Maya had once fallen. The air was solemn, every face subdued, some placing small bouquets beside the pump, others leaving handwritten notes of encouragement. These simple acts wove together into a communal ritual, transforming a place once marked by brutality into a space of trust and solidarity. Media crews arrived to capture the scene, broadcasting the sight of hundreds of glowing candles in the night reflected on solemn faces. News outlets called it the flame of memory, emphasizing that the community had not forgotten and would not forgive the injustice that occurred. Each frame aired stirred viewers across the country, many of whom sent candles and flowers to the station as their own way of joining in remembrance. The image of candles glowing over bare concrete served as a powerful reminder that truth never disappears. It lives lives on through collective action. In the stillness, as the night wind made the flames flicker, a message rose from the crowd at first. Just a few voices, then spreading into a unified chant, "Justice is not afraid of a kick." The words rang out strong, not with explosive anger, but with calm pride as a declaration carved deep into the moment. Everyone present felt the sincerity in each word, as if they were speaking not just for Maya, but for all who had suffered injustice, proclaiming to the world that justice may be tested, may be pushed back, but it will never fall. The slogan quickly became the new emblem of the movement. It was printed on banners, written on t-shirts, and painted on city walls as vibrant graffiti art. In speeches, human rights advocates used the phrase to open their remarks, making it the unifying motto of the cause. In other countries, young people shared it online, treating it as a message that crossed borders. From a small roadside gas station once lit only by flickering neon and filled with the cold scent of gasoline, it had now become a place of spiritual strength where the community found connection and belief. The candles, burning each night, stood like a steady flame, a reminder that justice cannot be extinguished by a single kick. On the contrary, it burns brighter in the face of injustice. And from that light, society as a whole understood that the journey toward change had truly begun. After the candlelight images at the gas station spread widely, the incident no longer remained within national borders but erupted onto the international stage. Major news outlets from the U.S., Europe, and Asia simultaneously featured it on their front pages with bold headlines reading like "Indictments, Racist Cop Scopes," a symbol of systemic decay. The articles detailed Scopes' actions, emphasizing that this wasn't an isolated event, but a clear example of corruption within law enforcement. Images of Maya collapsing and then rising in defiant dignity, placed beside Scopes' bowed head in court, were shown side by side like a stark contrast between truth and abuse of power. International television channels ran continuous coverage with commentators analyzing how a seemingly small event held the power to shake society and expose deep structural cracks. The media's reach quickly turned the story into a central topic of discussion at global forums. Human rights scholars compared it to historic turning points where a single captured moment altered the course of social justice. Analysis pieces stressed that the case couldn't be dismissed as a one-off act, but rather revealed a long-standing system that enabled discrimination. Scopes became a defining name tightly linked to a negative image, serving as a symbol of what humanity must reject. An editorial in a major British newspaper stated it wasn't Maya, but Scopes himself, who became a dark mirror for the world, a reminder that unchecked power breeds violence. The pressure didn't stop with journalists. International human rights organizations released formal statements. At a press conference in Geneva, a spokesperson from a major group spoke firmly, demanding that the U.S. government review its local police structures, especially in areas with a long history of racial discrimination. A petition was sent to the Department of Justice and the United Nations calling for tighter oversight alongside a list of specific proposals, including mandatory human rights training, independent police oversight mechanisms, and strict disciplinary procedures for offenders. The appeal not only intensified local accountability, but also sparked wider discussions in other countries where discrimination still persists. On social media, users from around the world shared international news clips commenting in many different languages, yet all expressing the same attitude, outrage, and determination to never let such a thing happen again. The slogan, "Justice doesn't fear a kick," was translated into French, Spanish, and Japanese, and spread across online platforms, becoming a global declaration of resilience against injustice. Students in many countries held group discussions and even organized memorials outside U.S. consulates, showing that the incident was no longer tied to one community, but had crossed borders becoming a wake-up call for the world. In that context, local authorities were forced to confront an unprecedented level of pressure, not just from domestic citizens but also from countless international voices, from respected newspapers to major human rights organizations. The image of Scopes being put on trial was framed in a global context, turning the case into a symbol of a much deeper issue that the law enforcement system had to answer for. Above all, global attention transformed Maya from an isolated victim into a symbol of defiant strength, and Scopes from a local abuser of power into a cautionary example of decay that the entire world could see and judge. As international outlets kept publishing in-depth coverage, television networks seized the moment to turn the case into a global media focal point. During primetime hours, nearly all major stations replayed the now infamous clip. The screen opened on Scopes, charging forward, his voice roaring the kick that brought Maya down. Immediately after, bold red letters flashed across the screen, "Big mistake." The words were large, commanding a verdict in themselves, capturing the fury and the undeniable truth. Viewers around the world watched, many stunned, many furious, and all understood that the moment wasn't just one man's mistake, it was proof of an entire system's failure. With every replay, conversations reignited, and the phrase, "big mistake," became a symbol of arrogance brought to account. Beyond television, major magazines also placed the story on their covers. An image of Maya sitting in the courtroom, bandages still on her face, her eyes bright with quiet pride, was chosen for nationwide publication. The cover bore a simple caption, "Strength and Truth," with Maya's gaze aimed directly into the lens. Not the look of a victim, but of a resilient person who had turned pain into a collective voice. People bought the magazine not just to read, but to keep it as a record of a historic moment. Online, the image was shared millions of times, becoming a symbol of inspiration even for those who had never known who Maya was. Special features were produced with journalists writing about Maya's everyday life story, how she grew up in a small community, her simple job, and her ordinary dreams before becoming an unwilling symbol. They analyzed how an ordinary woman, armed only with courage and belief, could shake a system long accustomed to silence. These articles spread quickly, translated into many languages, and soon Maya's image no longer belonged solely to America, but became a model of pride for women across the world. In many countries, social media campaigns used Maya's magazine cover as a symbol of unity. University students hung her photo in auditoriums, and human rights activists printed her quote on banners at marches. Her image moved from newsstands to city walls, from online articles to conversations around dinner tables. She did not need to speak much because the look in that photo said it all. Justice may be trampled, but the strength of truth will always rise again. At the same time, international television continued airing commentary programs intercut with replays of the clip marked with the words, "Big mistake," a reminder that the world would not forget or move on. Hosts asked direct questions. Can the system survive without reform? Viewers nodded in agreement, engaged in lively discussion, sensing clearly that this was no longer just a legal case, but a global lesson. And from the magazine covers to TV screens, from slogans to Maya's eyes, the story kept traveling, planting seeds of belief that justice never truly sleeps. When international headlines had yet to cool, Maya returned to her small room where piles of papers and old notebooks filled the corner of her desk. In the quiet, she picked up a pen and began to write each line slow, as if drawn straight from her heart. She wrote, "I did not seek revenge. I simply stood up." The words were simple, but each carried the weight of everything she had endured. It wasn't a defense nor an excuse, but a clear affirmation of why she had chosen to face her pain, to step into the whirlwind of justice, instead of letting darkness swallow her memories. Maya understood that her resilience was never about crushing her enemy, but about proving that truth cannot be forgotten and human dignity cannot be trampled. She later gave those pages to her family. In a warm room that smelled of old wood, her parents and relatives sat together, flipping through the papers, reading each word aloud with trembling voices. In those words, they found unending pain, but above all, the calm strength of a woman who had turned her wounds into power. Her mother read while covering her mouth, eyes red and tears streaming uncontrollably onto the page. Her father quietly gripped her hand, his shoulders shaken but his eyes glowing with pride. Her siblings bowed their heads, some crying, others smiling through tears. The room echoed with choked sobs, but no one felt heavy-hearted because in every tear there was pride, a recognition that Maya had risen not just for herself, but for them all. The silence that followed made everyone feel the sacred weight of those words. Her family understood that Maya hadn't written only for herself, but for the entire community, for those who had once bowed their heads to injustice. The sentence, "I did not seek revenge. I simply stood up," was passed around within the family as a lasting reminder. It was not a grand declaration, but a quiet truth. Anyone could feel a truth that stirred the heart more powerfully than any speech ever could. Soon after, the family shared her writings on social media. Maya's words appeared on thousands of personal pages, often alongside a photo of her seated at her desk, eyes calm and focused. Many read and wept. Others commented that they found strength and deep resonance in her word. News programs quoted Maya during their discussions, calling her statement a spiritual legacy, one that reached beyond a courtroom and became a source of strength for others to rise. Amid the growing ripple effect, Maya chose silence, not seeking further spotlight, because she understood that the greatest legacy didn't lie in being celebrated, but in others seeing themselves in her story and reclaiming their lost courage. Her family kept the original pages as a treasured keepsake, proof that their daughter had not only survived a tragedy, but transformed it into collective strength. And from that small room, from tears mingled with pride, a personal legacy was born, quiet but enduring, continuing to walk alongside society in its long journey toward justice. As major newspapers and television networks rushed to offer Maya exclusive interviews, she quietly declined. The enticing invitations and generous fees didn't sway her. Maya told her lawyer and family that she didn't want to turn pain into a stage, didn't want the story to become entertainment chasing views. "This story doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to the community," she said, her voice calm but firm. The decision surprised many, but also earned her deeper respect. People realized that what Maya wanted to preserve wasn't glamour, but authenticity, the unified voice that had risen from those once pushed to the margins. While stepping away from the noisy media, Maya chose a different path. She began keeping a journal, each page recording her emotions, reflections, and the uncertainties of the road to justice. It wasn't a dry report, but heartfelt writing soaked in sincerity. She wrote about the pain of falling onto cold cement, but also about the moment she saw the crowd's once silent eyes light up. She recalled the moment in court when she stood and questioned scopes, but also admitted to the long nights spent trembling in fear. The journal didn't glamorize or paint her as a hero, but included her vulnerabilities and her hope, making every reader feel closer to her. When parts of the notebook were shared online by her friends, it spread with lightning speed. Readers looked at her handwritten lines, shaky yet firm, as if hearing Maya's own voice speaking beside them. Excerpts were captured short phrases, turned into slogans, and shared across millions of personal accounts. Maya's journal gradually became known by another name, the Justice Oath. People shared it not to glorify one individual, but as a collective reminder that responsibility doesn't end with a verdict. It must continue in the way we live each day. In many communities, public readings of Maya's journal were held. People gathered in libraries and coffee shops, even in public squares, to read each page aloud. Voices rose among the crowd, sometimes trembling, sometimes sometimes resolute, but always leaving listeners in silence. They treated it as a shared ritual, where every word became a thread connecting them. Some cried upon hearing the line, "I wasn't seeking revenge. I just stood up," while others nodded when Maya admitted she once thought of giving up. All of it made the journal more than a stack of pages. It became a living vow passed from one person to another. Not long after, schools began incorporating excerpts from the journal into their lessons. Teachers used it to spark discussion to help students understand that justice isn't an abstract idea, but a choice made in real moments. Printed copies of the journal were handed out. Some students folded them neatly into their wallets as keepsakes. Others taped them to dorm walls as daily reminders. Maya's journal was no longer a personal document. It had become a shared legacy, a vow that people would continue to stand when truth needed protection. Maya observed the spread of her words in silence, offering no commentary, never trying to claim ownership. She let the community make the story theirs, just as she had intended from the beginning. And in the light of those pages traveling far and wide, Maya understood that her personal legacy had merged with the collective one, leaving behind a vow that would live on in the memory of society. As the candles at the gas station continued to be lit each evening, as Maya's journal pages echoed in public readings, the community gradually came to a crucial realization. Justice is not a privilege granted from above, but a right inherent to every human being. No one needs to beg for it, and no one should have to bow to have their dignity acknowledged. The verdict against Scopes was only a clear example that once the truth is revealed, the system must respond. Among tens of thousands of chants in the square and every discussion online or in classrooms, people repeated to one another that justice lives in every small act, in the courage of someone holding up a camera, in the honest testimony of a witness, and in the resilience of a woman who once fell but stood back up. The truth in this story did not appear easily. It was trampled, hidden, and threatened, but in the end, it rose with unstoppable strength. The image of Maya sitting silently in court, her faint smile and radiant eyes, became proof that truth can be wounded, can be smeared, but it can never be destroyed. The community learned that the cost of truth may be long nights of struggle, sweat, tears, and even blood, but that cost is never meaningless because it paves the way for future generations to live in a more just environment. Many called this a turning point, not just in a single trial, but in social awareness itself. Children growing up during this time would hear the story of Maya as a foundational lesson that silence is never the answer in the face of injustice. Adults looked inward, questioning how many times they had turned away from the truth, how many times fear had silenced their voice. The story compelled every person to answer that question for themselves, and from that cultivate the courage to choose differently next time. As time moved on and the event gradually receded into memory, the values it sparked remained intact. The slogan, "Justice is not afraid of a kick," was still chanted in new protests. The phrase, "Big mistake," still hung as a warning in many classrooms, and Maya's journal pages were still passed from hand to hand like a treasured artifact. This was how the community kept the truth alive, so no one would forget that at one moment a kick meant to silence a voice became the spark that ignited a movement for change. The end of this story was not in the downfall of one individual, but in the awakening of an entire society. People understood that justice is not something distant. It is present the moment someone decides not to look away. Truth, even when trampled, will always find a way to rise because it is fueled by human belief and determination. And in the light of that lesson, the community moved forward, carrying the belief that even in darkness, light can always be found, as long as someone dares to stand up and protect it. After all the trials, protests, articles, and the candles burning brightly each night at the gas station, the image of Scopes became an indelible mark in collective memory. He was no longer remembered as a police officer who once wore the sheriff's badge, but as a textbook example of arrogance meeting its consequence. Law lectures and police reform panels cited his name as a vivid case study. People mentioned Scopes not with reverence, but as a warning, a reminder that anyone who believes power entitles them to trample others will pay a heavy price. Photos of him smirking at parties were now placed beside the image of him slumped in court, the contrast laying bare his collapse. The phrase, "big mistake," continued to be used to refer to him, a label he would never be able to shake. In many places, journalists and scholars referred to Scopes as a cautionary figure, a negative symbol, but a necessary one, showing the consequences of corruption. He didn't just lose his job or face a verdict, he lost his personal legacy, his name forever tied to disgrace. Students studying civic rights heard his story as part of the curriculum, learning that the strength of the law lies not in the boots that crush the weak, but in its ability to protect everyone. Parents told their children about a moment in history when a man who thought he embodied the law was brought down in the eyes of the entire world, reminding them of the limits of power. On social media, whenever similar incidents surfaced, people brought up Scopes as a point of comparison. He became a unit of measure for arrogance, punished a tangible example of moral cause and effect. No one called him by title anymore, only by his bare name, now synonymous with downfall. To the public, his story was no longer isolated, but a shared legacy that reinforced the importance of vigilance, resistance, and standing on the side of truth. As time passed, Maya remained silent, allowing the story to be retold by the community in their own way. Yet every time someone mentioned Scopes, they also mentioned Maya, as two opposing poles of the same event, one marked by arrogance and its cost, the other by resilience and inspiration. And in that shared memory, people understood that it was precisely this contrast that etched the lesson deeper into society. The story ends with a simple yet resounding conclusion printed on posters shouted across public squares, written on city walls. 3 minutes later, karma arrived, and this time the whole world watched. It is more than a sharp phrase. It is a declaration that justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it has the power to tear through every layer of concealment. And once the world has witnessed it, that lesson will live on, reminding every generation that truth always finds a way to rise, forcing even the most arrogant to bow before justice. The story began at a deserted gas station at night, where Maya's personal pain ignited a fire that awakened an entire society. From the moment she fell to Deputy Scopes' kick, a chain reaction was set in motion, carrying the public from silent outrage to a powerful uprising. That journey didn't just bring Scopes from his arrogant position as sheriff to a criminal judged by the world, it also turned Maya into a symbol of resilience and of an unquenchable thirst for justice. What matters most is not what happened inside the courtroom, but how the community saw its own strength reflected in the case. A kick that seemed like an isolated act of violence became the catalyst for a wave of change. People realized that truth can be distorted, but once captured and voiced, it breaks through every boundary and echoes far beyond. A student's question, a witness's confession, the courage of someone holding a camera together, they formed the chain that pulled justice back into place. No one felt alone anymore, because even the smallest action could spark a light. Throughout that journey, Maya never chose revenge. She stood up with the calm of someone who understands that the greatest strength comes from belief. When she wrote in her journal, "I didn't seek revenge, I just stood up," it wasn't just a personal reflection, it became a shared oath for the entire community. Her family read it through tears, and society saw it as proof that dignity never disappears. It only waits for someone strong enough to awaken it. And as the journal spread, it no longer belonged only to Maya, but became a collective legacy, a living declaration for a new generation. The greatest lesson left by this story is that justice is never a gift granted from above. It is the rightful claim of every person. No one has the right to stand above others and call themselves the law, because power without accountability becomes becomes violence. Scopes is the clearest proof of that. He once believed the silence of the public would protect him, but when the truth was exposed, the entire facade collapsed. From a powerful sheriff, he became a symbol of decay, and that downfall became the warning bell for all who confuse authority with justice. The story also affirms that truth, even when trampled, can rise again. It may be buried under fear, but once light is cast upon it, it will blaze stronger than ever. The image of Maya, sitting quietly with a gentle smile in court, her eyes glowing, is proof that truth may carry wounds but never surrenders. She did not fall, and neither did the community, because they turned pain into strength. This is also a lesson in solidarity. One individual can spark the flame, but for that flame to grow into a movement, it takes the unity of an entire community. From students, journalists, and human rights organizations to ordinary citizens, everyone came together to form a pressure that could not be ignored. Every voice, every small action contributed to the final verdict, and from that society learned that real power lies in collective connection. In the end, what makes this story a legacy is not just Maya's victory, but the awakening it left behind. People understood that justice does not fear a kick, because that kick only woke the community up. Scopes paid the price for his arrogance, while Maya left behind a lesson that dignity and truth, once defended, become a guiding light. And the simple yet haunting closing line was repeated again and again. 3 minutes later, karma arrived, and this time the whole world watched.